We looked last week at the productivity challenge facing Australian agriculture and related research on climate change. This week, Chris Clark talks to two specialists on what climate change might mean for our soils and the possibilities being opened up by gene technology.
If the climate is changing, the prediction is for warmer, drier conditions in Australia's most productive agricultural regions.
A drier, warmer system is probably going to result in less water available to produce crops. And across dryland agriculture, the availability of water is one of our first constraints. We want to try and maximize the use of that water and get as big a crop as we can out of that water. So if we're moving towards a drier climate, one of the constraints we're going to be faced with is, are yields going to decline in response to less water being available to grow a crop?
The answer to that question will depend in part on our soils. Dr. Jeff Baldock is a soil specialist at the CSIRO.
There's evidence to suggest that as the carbon content of a soil or the organic matter content of a soil goes up, those soils can hold more water. So of the rain that falls then, they'll hang on to it a bit more. Therefore, more of it might become available to the plants. Where there's episodic big rainfall events, instead of having as much runoff, we might be able to have a little bit more run into the soil and be held there for the plants to use. Building carbon from the point of view of holding on to water and making more of the water that does fall accessible to plants would be one way to modify the soil to help combat against any future drying that might occur.
So where are we on the graph of soil management in Australia?
It's a really interesting question, and I guess what I'd say to answer that is we know through measurement that many of our agricultural systems have lost significant amounts of carbon since the implementation of agriculture. The values range from anywhere from 20% to 70%. So systems where we've lost significant amount of carbon, if we can redefine our agriculture to allow carbon to accumulate, there might be a long way in some instances that we can go. We'll have to treat each case individually, but there's a basic premise that we can use, and that is if we can grow and capture as much carbon with the available resource that we have and put as much carbon back into the ground as is possible, we'll push soil carbon contents in the right direction, or we'll be maximizing the carbon content that could be there.
What does a climate model that predicts a warmer, drier Australia mean for the greenhouse gas emissions from our soils, whether it be carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide, for example?
All the processes that generate greenhouse gases, be it carbon dioxide or nitrous oxide or methane from soil, are biological processes. They all depend on microorganisms that live in the soil. As a result, if temperatures go up, generally those processes all ramp up a little bit, go a little bit faster. However, at the same time as the soils dry down, those processes will also slow down because the same things that drive plants, lots of water and warmth, also drive microorganisms. So it's a difficult question to answer right now. We're looking at trying to do some modeling scenarios to work out what the projected difference might be. But we might find that even though the temperature has gone up a little bit, the effect of the drying outweighs the effect of the temperature, and our net emissions of nitrous oxide may actually fall. In the case of nitrous oxide, the bigger potential exists for us to better manage nitrogen in our agricultural systems. If we can keep or match our delivery of nitrogen to a crop with the demand that that crop places, we'll keep the pool of nitrogen that's subject to nitrification and denitrification and subsequent N2O emissions at a very low level. And right there, we've already dealt with most of the problem.
Nitrogen is critical for plant growth, but it takes energy to produce and apply. And nitrous oxide, which comes from the nitrogen crops can't absorb, is one of the most potent greenhouse gases.
We know from the perspective of greenhouse gas emissions that some of the nitrogen fertilizers applied to the soil will volatilize off as nitrous oxide. It's been estimated by various groups that this is about a third of all agricultural emissions in terms of greenhouse impact is nitrous oxide, because it has about 300 times the impact of CO2. So it's a very important greenhouse gas.
Professor Rick Roush from Melbourne University says new genetically modified crops might provide an answer.
And the reason why genetically modified crops could be really important in this is people are experimenting with crops that are now called nitrogen use efficient, or NUE. And some of these have shown the capacity to maintain yields with conventional cultivars with only half the applications of nitrogen. So the implications for this in agriculture are wide-ranging. If you could reduce the amount of nitrogen that had to be applied to crops by 50% across a lot of broadacre crops, you reduce all the energy that was used to produce the nitrogen from coal or natural gas, the energy required to carry the nitrogen to the fields, work the nitrogen in the fields when it arrives, and then reduce the emissions in the air or even runoff into streams and so forth. So the impacts could be enormous, and in addition to just reducing the cost of producing crops.
So are these nitrogen-efficient crops in commercial use yet?
They're not yet in commercial application, but they are in field trials. And so in Canada, they've already trialed canola crops that could yield 3.2 tons per hectare across a threefold range of fertilizer application.
How long until they might be in commercial use?
All genetically modified crops typically take at least a decade to actually reach the commercial market. There's a lot of people would be surprised to learn that these days often the greatest cost in developing a genetically modified crop and bringing it to market is really in satisfying the regulatory agencies that crops are safe for human health and the environment. So even though these crops look very attractive, they seem to be working really well, there's no obvious reason to think that there could be any downside for the environment or for human health. They'll still have to be extensively tested and go through extensive regulatory scrutiny.
Do you think these nitrogen use efficient plants could be a bit of a game changer in the whole GM debate?
From my perspective, we've been through this before where some people have said, as soon as we get traits that are really attractive to consumers, we'll address that. And I think that's probably not true. There is a core of people out there that are really opposed to this for a variety of reasons, really concerned about the impact. And I don't know that any one item will be a game changer. But certainly, for the vast majority of people concerned about environment, looking at these issues, anything that could significantly reduce the production and use of nitrogen has to be a huge environmental plus.